Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I am Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House. I'm taking a look at some of the guns that they are going to be selling in their upcoming February of 2016 regional auction. Now, one that jumped out at me here in the rifle racks was this 1870 pattern Berdan rifle. Now, most people in the US are probably going to recognize Hiram Berdan for his involvement in the US Civil War. He was a general, and he's well known for Berdan's sharpshooters, group of early snipers, and frankly many other things. Well, Berdan also dabbled in firearms design, and one of his major clients was Imperial Russia. So Berdan had two major rifle designs, the model of 1868 and the 1870. Now, the 1868 was, you could think of it basically like a trapdoor Springfield style of rifle, where the breech block pivoted open, load a cartridge. It was a good design for converting existing muskets, that sort of thing. It was never nearly as popular as what's come to be known as the Berdan II rifle, which was this 1870 pattern. So this is actually a bolt-action rifle, very much in the style of early bolt-action rifles. Has a single locking lug, which is the bolt handle here, which we'll take a look at a little more closely in a moment. And these rifles were found and liked by the Russian Empire. The Russians actually, probably a lot of folks in the US aren't familiar with it, but in the latter half of the 1800s, Russia was doing a lot of armament upgrading. And they sent some emissaries to the US to look for good small arms technology that they could adopt and use. And one of the famous things that they found was the Gatling gun. Now, the Russian ordnance officer who came to the US and who went back and set up production of a lot of these guns was a fellow named Gorlov. And in Russia, the Gatling actually became known as the Gorlov gun, associated with his name. The Russians produced a great many Gatling guns. Well, they also found the Berdan rifle here very appealing. And in total, they ended up making something like 3 million or more of these Berdan II 1870 pattern rifles. This was the standard arm of the Russian Imperial Army until the adoption of the Mosin-Nagant in 1891. So, couple things. This was a black powder rifle, of course, dating from the 1870s. It is a 42 caliber, so in Russian parlance we would call this a 4.2 line rifle, the line being a unit of measurement equal to 1/10 of an inch. In metric, this would be 10.67 by 58 rimmed. Like I said, it was a black powder cartridge. Standard loading on it was a 370 grain bullet, which was fired at a little over 1,400 feet per second. That's a 77 grain charge of black powder. So, pretty typical early black powder large bore military cartridge. Kind of an interesting historical amalgamation of figures involved with this rifle. Of course, the design was from an American, Berdan. When the Russians, the first purchases actually came from BSA in the United Kingdom. They bought about 30,000 of these rifles manufactured there. And they also bought the tooling to manufacture these rifles from England. And once that tooling came over, several years later, then they were able to set up Russian imperial factories to start production of these rifles. So the first was the Tula plant, which started production in 1874, followed by the Ishevsk plant, which started production in 1878. And it was those Russian factories that produced the huge quantities of these rifles that would eventually be made. So among all of these rifles, there were actually three different sizes, three different variations. There was the infantry rifle, which is what we have here. And then there was also a cavalry version and a dragoon version. Now, dragoons are basically mounted infantry, so guys who use horses for transportation, but when they go into combat, they leave the horses behind and they march into combat. So dragoon rifles were typically an intermediate length gun, a little bit shorter for easier carry on horseback, but they didn't have to be so short as to be fireable from horseback, like a cavalry carbine. So all three versions were made of the Berdan rifles. Like I said, this is an infantry pattern. The infantry pattern is also interesting for having early volley sights on it. We'll take a closer look at those in a minute, as I said, but there's a notch here on the rear sight, and there's a little front sight spike post on the front barrel band that you use for a volley sight. These were used heavily in a number of wars. The first one really being the Russo-Turkish War, where unfortunately for the Russians, these didn't really turn out to work quite as well as the Martini-Henry rifles that the Turks had. But, of course, they stayed in Russian service. They were used in World War I. A large number of them were captured by Austro-Hungarian forces and sometimes used in their original 10.7 millimeter cartridge. Some of them were also converted to the Austro-Hungarian 8x50 rimmed smokeless powder cartridge. You're looking at kind of dubious strength of this action for doing something like that, but it was done. After the Russians had adopted the Mosin-Nagant, about 200,000 of these were actually converted in Belgium for the 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge. That, if I can get my hands on one of those, that will be a very cool follow-up video. In order to do that safely, they actually had to redesign a new 2-lug bolt head for these rifles to allow them to stand the pressure of 7.62 by 54 compared to the original black powder loading. So these are fairly uncommon rifles to find in the United States, despite the fact that so many of them were originally made. They have a pretty rich combat history in Russia, and I think they're a very interesting rifle. Why don't I bring the camera back here and let's take a quick look at the bolt up close. It's got an interesting disassembling method that I want to show you. All right, so here is our Berdan rifle action. This is a cock-on closing bolt. So bolt cycles open, you would drop a cartridge in there and then close the bolt. And at this point right here, the sear catches back here. And then the rest of the closing the action is done against spring tension. So we push that forward, rotate it down. It is somewhat unusual in that it only moves about 45 degrees over to lock. This is fully locked, so the bolt handle here acts as our single locking lug, which for an early black powder round like this is just fine. You can actually see a bit of a gap there. That would be to accommodate the rather large rim of the case. And then when you pull the trigger, the back half of the bolt drops. That drops a striker, firing pin, and fires the cartridge. Opening it is very simple. When you open this, it cams the firing pin spring open slightly, and then we can pull it back. Now to remove the bolt, you have to do something a little bit unusual, which is neat. Typically it would be pulling the trigger and holding the trigger down while you pull the bolt out. That's how this typically works. However, I'm going to use once again, my universal gun disassembly tool here. What we actually need to do to pull this out is, you can see we have this little hook on the bottom, the ejector there. We're going to push down on that with my tool here, and then the bolt slides out the back of the gun. I'm not going to pull this all the way apart. You would do that by taking out the screws, of course, but we have our firing pin spring tensioned inside there, and you can see a nice mechanical safety such that when the bolt is straight in line like this, which means that the bolt handle would have to be upright, so not locked, the firing pin is cammed backwards and inside the bolt head. So the firing pin can only protrude out and fire the cartridge when the bolt handle is rotated over about 45 degrees and locked. That is the built-in mechanical safety for this rifle to prevent it from firing out a battery. So our extractor is up here on the top. The ejector was on the bottom. That's what the case hits when you pull it back, and that flips it out the top of the rifle. Not a whole lot else going on here. There is no mechanical manual safety on the gun because, of course, it's a single-shot rifle. So if you want to render it safe, take the cartridge out. I had also mentioned the Volley Sights. Well, here is the rear notch for our Volley Sight. What you would do is take this sight, lift it up, and then you have graduations on the back of the rear sight here. So this can be raised or lowered on the rear sight here. This goes out to 2200. By the way, that would be 2200 arshins, which was the standard Russian unit of measurement at the time, an arshin being equivalent to 3/4 of a yard. Now for the front end of our Volley Sights, we have this spike on the side of the front barrel band. All right, so here we have the front Volley Sight in focus. And if I bring the focus back to the rear sight, right to there, you kind of get an idea for what you're looking at. last but not least, I do want to point out that these rifles were made for the Russian Tsar, and so they do have a Russian Imperial Eagle here on the receiver crest. That's something you will see on Mosin-Nagant rifles as well until 1917, when the Tsar was overthrown. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you would like to own this rifle yourself, it is coming up for sale here at Rock Island. It is part of a lot, as are many of the guns in the regional auctions like this one. So if you take a look in the description text below, you will find a link to the catalog page for the lot that includes this rifle. You can check out the pictures of it and the other guns that come with it. And if you decide you'd like to have them yourself, place a bid online, or you could even come down here in person to participate in the auction. Thanks for watching.